In the skies over southern England in the summer of 1940, one of the crucial battles of World War II was fought. If the British lost the Battle of Britain, they would be wide open to German invasion and forced to make peace on Hitler's terms. Europe would have remained a Nazi slave empire. But the British did win the battle, and this was largely thanks to the Gladiators of RAF Fighter Command.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Fighter Command was born from the scout pilots of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy Air Service, who duelled with their German opponents over the Western Front during World War I. On the 1st of April 1918, the Royal Naval Air Service and Royal Flying Corps were merged to form the Royal Air Force. It was the world's first independent air arm. But after the war, it was swiftly run down. By 1922, there were only 3 fighter squadrons available for home defense. It was then planned to build a force of 52 squadrons for the air defense of Great Britain, of which 1/3 would be fighters. The prevailing mood of world disarmament caused this to be put back to 1936. Matters changed radically in January 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. In March 1935, he revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe, boasting that it was already as strong as the RAF. The British government replied by rushing through expansion plans for the RAF. A year later, the air defense of Great Britain was reorganized into 4 separate commands: fighter, bomber, coastal, and training. Fighter Command's first commander-in-chief was Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Highly respected but austere, he was nicknamed Stuffy by his men. When Dowding took over, Fighter Command had only 16 squadrons, each of 12 aircraft, and just over 200 pilots. It was equipped with biplanes, like the Hawker Fury and the Hawker Demon. These lacked the speed and the necessary early warning to engage bombers before they struck their target. But Dowding inherited and encouraged 2 vital technical developments which would transform his command. Radar, a contraction of radio detection and ranging, enabled approaching aircraft to be detected by reflecting radio waves off them. A chain of stations was rapidly built along England's south coast. And the all-metal frame monoplane fighter, capable of significantly higher speeds than the traditional biplane, was introduced. The first was the Hawker Hurricane, designed by Sidney Camp. The other was R.J. Mitchell's Supermarine Spitfire. By the outbreak of war in 1939, most of Dowding's aircraft were the new Spitfire and Hurricane. Furthermore, he had doubled the strength of his command. The backbone of his pilots were the regular officers who had been trained at the RAF's academy at Cranwell. They were augmented by pilots on short service commissions, which bound them to 4 years active service followed by 10 on the reserve. Many came from the Dominions, like New Zealander Al Deer, who would become one of the leading aces. And another ace, South African Salem Alan, who got his nickname because he'd been a merchant seaman before joining the RAF. There were also the non-commissioned pilots, who made up 25% of each squadron's aircrew. The regular squadrons were supported by the part-time flyers of the RAF Volunteer Reserve. these were backed up by the Royal Auxiliary Air Force squadrons, which also did most of their flying at weekends. The romance of the air was at its height in the 1930s, with ever longer pioneering flights. But like Christopher Foxley Norris and his friend Richard Hillary, most of the weekend flyers played down their enthusiasm.
But for example, he and I both joined the Oxford University Air Squadron, but we certainly didn't do it so that we could become better pilots. We did it to enjoy ourselves.
Despite this modesty, most of them knew that they were the heirs of the aces of World War I. And their confidence was high.
We had a wonderful aeroplane, armor plating at the back, a great big engine in front, and was sitting on a parachute and with 8 machine guns. So you really were a modern knight and prepared to take on anything.
James Sanders would become one of the aces of the Battle of Britain. But in the summer of 1939, it was still an open question as to how the young bloods of Fighter Command would match up to actual combat. Their test was soon upon them. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Two days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and a British expeditionary force began to cross the English Channel to support the French army. With it went the Royal Air Force, including 4 Fighter Command Hurricane squadrons. This left Hugh Dowding, Fighter Command's chief, with a total of 33 squadrons for the defense of Britain. 3 were equipped with the Bristol Blenheim, which was fundamentally a bomber and no match for modern monoplane fighters. Another 3 squadrons had the obsolescent Gloucester Gladiator, but the remainder had Hurricanes or Spitfires. During the Phoney War, which followed the fall of Poland, Fighter Command's main task was to protect shipping on Britain's east coast, and the Royal Navy in its anchorages at Scapa Flow and Rosyth. It was during a German attack on Rosyth on the 16th of October 1939 that the command had its first successes of the war. Hurricane shot down 2 Heinkel HE-111 bombers. The fighter squadrons in France also had some success against German reconnaissance aircraft. But the onset of winter, which was exceptionally severe, put a brake on the air operations of both sides. With the coming of spring, the war hotted up once more. Germany invaded Norway and Denmark in April 1940. Fighter Command sent a squadron of Gladiators to Norway, but all were lost to German air attack in just a couple of days as they attempted to operate from a frozen lake. Dowding had also been forced to send a further 6 squadrons to France by May 1940. And when the Germans did attack, 4 more Hurricane squadrons immediately deployed to France. They were soon giving a good account of themselves, but they were facing overwhelming odds, and another 32 Hurricanes were also sent out. As the German blitzkrieg swept across France, the French pleaded for yet more fighters. But Dowding was deeply concerned that his resources for defending Britain were becoming too thin, and persuaded the War Cabinet that no more fighter squadrons should be sent to France. Within 2 weeks, the Germans succeeded in trapping the British Expeditionary Force, together with substantial numbers of French and Belgian troops, in a pocket around the port of Dunkirk. Hermann Goering boasted that his Luftwaffe would destroy them on its own. The German airmen did their best. But they could not prevent 340,000 Allied troops being brought back to Britain. Much of the credit for the miracle of Dunkirk must go to Fighter Command, whose pilots fought valiantly to keep the Luftwaffe off the rescue ships. One pilot who saw his first combat during this battle was 30-year-old Douglas Bader. He had graduated from Cranwell a decade earlier. Soon afterwards, he suffered an horrific air crash, which resulted in the amputation of both his legs, forcing him to leave the RAF. But sheer determination got Bader past fit to fly in early 1940, and he quickly justified himself, achieving his first kill, an Me-109, over Dunkirk.
He must have been a beginner like myself, because he stayed flying absolutely straight and level while I shot him down, you know, without moving. We didn't have air superiority, but we had enough. The Germans left Dunkirk and went on to Paris and so on, which was a great mistake of theirs, really. We lost quite a lot of airplanes at Dunkirk and some jolly good pilots.
Quite a lot of aeroplanes was over 400, as well as 153 jolly good pilots. They were losses Dowding could ill afford. He knew that the crucial battle, that for domination of England's skies, was about to take place. If he lost it, German invasion appeared inevitable. Across the English Channel, the Luftwaffe could marshal over 1,100 medium bombers. Some 320 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, 800 Me-109 single-engine fighters, and 250 twin-engine Me-110 fighters. Also within range of Britain were a further 150 bombers and Me-110s based in Norway and Denmark. This armada was flown by crews who had been blooded in the Spanish Civil War and honed their combat skills in Poland. To oppose them, Dowding had approximately 800 fighters, but only his 700 Spitfires and Hurricanes really counted. If they were to be fully effective, efficient command, control, and communications were essential. Dowding had organized his force in 4 groups. Number 10 group covered southwest England. Its commander, South African Sir Quintin Brand, had been one of the pilots who had made the first flight from London to Cape Town in 1920. New Zealander Keith Park's number 11 group was responsible for southeast England, the most critical sector. Park had been Dowding's senior staff officer, and the commander-in-chief had every confidence in him. Based in East Anglia and the Midlands, number 12 group provided depth to the frontline defences. Trafford Lee Mallory, the group commander, had a background of air cooperation with ground forces. Finally, Richard Saul's number 13 group covered the north of England and southern Scotland. Dowding was heavily reliant on the chain of radar stations covering the south and east coasts for early warning of the approach of hostile aircraft. This home chain system sent the information of the build-up of enemy raids direct to the filter room at Headquarters Fighter Command at Bentley Priory on the northwest outskirts of London. Here, the direction and strength of the raids were identified, and the information passed simultaneously to the operations rooms at Bentley Priory, the group HQs, and the sector HQs within each group. Once the raiders had crossed the English coast, their progress was monitored by the Observer Corps, which was made up of civilian volunteers. The group HQs decided which squadrons to scramble, while the sector ops rooms within each group controlled the fighters in the air, guiding them on to the enemy formations. Two other elements played an important part in the British air defences. Anti-aircraft command controlled ground-based air defence weapons, while RAF Balloon Command manned the barrage balloons, which were designed to deter low-level attack. For many, the Spitfire has come to symbolise fighter command in the Battle of Britain. Pilots like former ace Brian Kincombe found it a delight to fly.
It was responsive in the same way that a really first-class horse is responsive.
The Spitfire was reckoned a good match for the German Me-109 and was used to attack these bomber escorts. The more numerous but less glamorous Hurricane also had its strengths.
We, the Hurricane pilots, knew we could outturn by outturning it, going round the smaller circle. If you both were turning, he was trying to shoot you down, given a few turns and you were in a position to shoot at him.
Geoffrey Page and his companions tended to concentrate on shooting down the enemy bombers. One British weakness was tactics, something which some pilots had already identified. The basic RAF formation was the three-plane Vic. Attacks were carried out as drills laid down in the Manual of Air Fighting. This was in contrast to the Luftwaffe, which put its greater combat experience to good use in developing the Finger 4 formation. This provided much more flexibility and better protection against being jumped by hostile fighters. Dowding had no worries over fighter production, which had recently been stepped up. But he was deeply concerned about his slender reserves of trained pilots. Although the training organization was expanded in July 1940 to produce 115 instead of 39 fighter pilots every 2 weeks, it would take time for his command to benefit. Dowding's worries remained acute, especially as casualties started to rise. In addition to calling up all available reserves, more pilots were brought in from overseas. Among them, the combat-experienced Polish pilots, who had escaped to Britain having already engaged the Luftwaffe twice, over their home country as well as France, and trained pilots from France and Czechoslovakia. The RAF even recruited a few American volunteers. However good the pilots and their machines, they were totally reliant on their ground crews, as Bob Stanford Tuck, another Battle of Britain ace, later acknowledged.
On occasions you'd land in a hot, terribly hot day and you'd taxi in, switch off, jump out, and they'd swarm onto the thing, open up all the cowlings, the engine fitter would be at it quickly checking this, refueling, they'd be shoveling ammunition into the aircraft as hard as they could go. The radio operator would be there with the side flap open, working on the radio, but all working like absolute beavers.
The ground crews took pride in the speed they could turn the aircraft round. One young fitter was interviewed after the battle by the BBC.
The other part of it, from a squadron landing to a squadron being airborne again, I think it was actually officially in the end done in 7 minutes, from the time the first one touched down to the last one's airborne.
The Battle of Britain officially began on the 10th of July 1940. During the first month of fighting, the Luftwaffe tried to tempt the RAF out over the Channel by attacking convoys. Dowding refused to rise to the bait, although there were some fierce clashes just off the English south coast, particularly around the port of Dover. The fierceness of the battles can be judged from this contemporary radio report about the interception of a Stuka attack.
But now the British fighters are coming up. And here they come in absolute steep dive. You can see their bombs actually leave the machines and come into the water. There's one coming down in flames, coming down, there's a long streak, coming down completely out of control, a long streak of smoke. There's a fight going on, you can hear the little rattle from machine gun bullets. So we've just hit a Messerschmitt. Oh, that was beautiful. He's coming right down now. I think definitely that first got him. Oh boy, I've never seen anything so good as this. Oh, yes.
On the 12th of August, Goering began to mount his main assault. The primary targets were radar stations and forward airfields. Luckily for Dowding, the attacks on the radars were not sustained for long, and most survived. 3 days later came what Goering called Adlertag, or Eagle Day. This massive assault was designed to destroy the RAF once and for all. The Luftwaffe flew nearly 1,500 sorties. It was handicapped by the fact that its fighters only had fuel for a few minutes' combat over England. Soon it was losing between 2 and 3 times as many aircraft as the British, 45 to 13 on Adlertag alone. The 18th of August was a crisis day. The Germans attacked a number of the crucial sector headquarters airfields. Command and control was severely disrupted. The RAF lost 34 precious aircraft to the Luftwaffe's 71. But despite their losses, the Germans were still sure that their superior numbers and experience must prevail, as this Nazi newsreel makes clear.
Geschwader auf Geschwader. Ihre Kette reißt nicht mehr ab. So geht es Tag und Nacht und Stunde um Stunde. Die deutsche Luftwaffe hält erbarmungslos Abrechnung.
Given this pressure, could Fighter Command hold out? During the perfect summer days of late August 1940, the skies above southern England were full of contrails as the grim battle went on. The RAF crews were constantly in action and always outnumbered. Aces Roland Beaumont and Dennis David described the heroic struggle.
You're never going to break up a big formation with 7 Hurricanes. You're not going to break up 100 by just coming in behind them. All you'll do is pick off 1 or 2. But if you attack them from the front, there's a good chance you'll make the formations break to avoid you. And then after that, you could get back in and start to try to attack individual airplanes.
There wasn't time for bloody tactics. Our tactics were to attack the enemy as quickly as possible.
You got straight into a melee and it was every man for himself.
I sometimes got very close and had German oil all over my windshield.
Those on the ground could only watch and hope. On the 20th of August, Winston Churchill summed up what everyone was thinking.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
The pilots were becoming exhausted by the constant stress. Throughout the hours of daylight, they were on standby, usually waiting in or just outside the dispersal hut, close to their aircraft. Although they tried not to show it, everyone was keyed up for the ring of the telephone. It could be a routine administrative query or the order to scramble. Sometimes, when the German pressure was intense, the pilots had to wait in their cockpits. Occasionally, a squadron would be granted a 24-hour stand-down, which usually ran from midday to noon on the following day. some pilots dashed up to the flesh pots in London. But many were content just to have a few beers at their local hotel or pub. When they were on duty, the pilots often flew up to 5 or 6 sorties per day. Once in the air, the adrenaline would race as they listened out on their radios to the ground controller's instructions, guiding them onto the approaching German planes. He was helped by the plotters, who marked the progress of the raid on a giant map board. As a leading ace Johnny Johnson describes, pilots tried to keep detached from the reality of what they were doing.
I never thought about the man in the machine, killing him. I just wanted to shoot that thing down with a black cross on it.
Inevitably, at the end of a sortie, pilots would be missing.
It's very hard for people to realise today that you sit down to breakfast with somebody and he's never seen again after that meal. And it's a terrible loss, really. But so much so that, as to an individual, I stopped making friends who were other pilots.
On the 24th of August, the Luftwaffe increased the fighter escorts for its bombers and mounted a renewed assault on Fighter Command's airfields, especially those of No. 11 Group. With his squadron suffering heavy losses and the surviving pilots becoming exhausted, Keith Park was increasingly concerned that his group might disintegrate. To help him, Dowding began to replace some of Park's depleted squadrons with ones from other groups. But as Lawrence Thorogood later described, the standard of the newer pilots was inevitably dropping.
The total number of hours I'd got in on Hurricanes was just 20 hours. And we're being called on to go into squadrons with inadequate training on the gunnery side, which after all was the absolute key to the whole business, to shoot. A friend of mine carried out 2 attacks on an enemy bomber with his guns at safe. That means they wouldn't fire anyway. But he just didn't realize that his guns weren't working because he didn't know what to expect. He thought, my, they are very silent, these guns.
It looked as if Fighter Command must eventually be ground down in defeat. But then on the 7th of September, the Luftwaffe dramatically changed tactics. 2 weeks earlier, one or more German bomber crews had inadvertently bombed London. The following night, RAF Bomber Command made a retaliatory attack on Berlin. Although it caused little damage, Hitler ordered attacks on London by day and by night. Keith Park later recalled this critical moment in the battle.
The night they turned their bombers onto the city of London and set it alight, I flew over the city in my Hurricane, and I looked down at the lower Thames, which was well alight from all the petrol tanks, and I said, thank God, because I knew that once they'd started on bombing London, I felt certain they'd keep on bombing the Thames and leave my aerodromes free to be reconstructed.
It was feared that this change meant that German invasion was imminent, and that same evening of the 7th of September, the code word Cromwell was issued, putting all defending forces on heightened alert. But in reality, Hitler was beginning to acknowledge that his Luftwaffe was not winning the Battle of Britain. On the 10th of September, he postponed his projected invasion for 2 weeks. Goering, however, was determined to make one last all-out effort to crush Fighter Command. On the 15th of September, he launched another massive attack on London, which was designed to get the RAF's remaining fighters into the air so that he could destroy them. Dowding's men rose up to meet the challenge. Virtually every aircraft that Fighter Command possessed was flung into the assault. One of the most extraordinary kills that day was made by Ray Holmes, who had already downed 2 Germans when he saw bombers streaking low over the capital.
There was St. Paul's Cathedral, there was Buckingham Palace and all these places, and he was on a dead straight line for all these places. And as far as I was concerned, he wasn't going to get there. As I got within firing range, about 400 yards, I opened fire, and immediately the gun spluttered. I'd got nothing left. And I knew now that the only way of getting the chap down was to take his tailplane off. His tailplane was looking so fragile there, and to me it looked like a model aeroplane, as if you could just chop it. And I thought my wing at that speed would go right through his tail and take the tail off. Instead of taking the piece of the tail off that I wanted to take off, it took the whole of the twin tail section. This is the Dornier coming down. This is the fuselage with the wingtips missing and the tail missing. And this is the tail, and they both came down together and landed on Victoria Station.
Amazingly, a cameraman filmed the last moments of Holmes's kill. The Luftwaffe lost 60 aircraft, while the RAF lost exactly half as many. There could be no surer proof that Goering had failed, and 2 days later Hitler ordered an indefinite postponement of his invasion of Britain. The Battle of Britain rumbled on until the end of October. By then, the emphasis of the German assault had switched to attacks by night on Britain's cities and towns. This blitz would last until May 1941. In the aftermath of the Battle of Britain, Hugh Dowding retired. Many of the few who now called themselves Dowding's chicks because of the way he had cared for them felt that he was not given the recognition that he deserved for his leadership in one of the most decisive conflicts in history. Nevertheless, in 1943, he was ennobled as Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. During the night assault on Britain's cities, Fighter Command had to develop new defensive skills. These were based on the development of airborne interception radar. Blenheims and then the faster and more maneuverable Bristol Beaufighter were used for this role. The Beaufighter had specifically been designed as a night fighter, although it went on to act as an escort fighter and ground attack aircraft. During 1942, the even more versatile and fast Mosquito would be adapted for this role. Tracking down enemy bombers and engaging them required the closest coordination between the pilot and his navigator, who operated the radar.
2 o'clock, 15 all the time, steady. Range coming down to about 800 feet. Overtaking about 5 miles an hour.
Have a look with the glasses.
Where is it?
Right above there, about 50 degrees at 1 o'clock. You see him? We're right below him.
Yes, I see him, yes. Hold on.
Sholto Douglas, a distinguished World War I scout pilot, succeeded Dowding as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. Douglas believed that the time had come to go over to the attack. his fighters began to mount two types of operation over occupied Europe: rhubarbs, sweeps by small groups of fighters on their own, and circuses, groups of day bombers escorted by fighters. Douglas made no secret of his tactics. The aim was to draw German fighters from their airfields in northern France and destroy them in the air. For the first 6 months of 1941, these operations were pursued sparingly, with equal loss rates for either side. But when the Germans invaded Russia in June 1941, the tempo was stepped up, so as to keep as much as possible of the Luftwaffe tied down in the west. This worked well, with experienced pilots being transferred from the Eastern Front to make good losses in the west. But the rhubarbs and circuses were costly. One reason was that the RAF fighters were now operating over hostile territory. Like their Luftwaffe adversaries the previous summer, they were limited by fuel and the amount of time that they could spend in combat. The second reason was that the Germans had introduced a formidable new fighter, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, which far outclassed the standard Fighter Command Spitfire II. Douglas Bader, who was now leading a wing on cross-channel sweeps, explained how the FW-190 was countered.
Now, what they did then, the British manufacturers, they engined up the Spitfire, and it was a Spitfire 9. And the Spitfire 9 reigned supreme for the rest of the war. It was better than the 190. It outclimbed it, outdid everything.
With his tin legs and 22 confirmed victories to his credit, Bader himself thought he was indestructible. But while leading his wing over Lille in northern France in a rhubarb operation on the 9th of August 1941, he finally fell victim to an FW-190. Bader managed to bail out and was entertained by German fighter ace Adolf Galland before being imprisoned for the rest of the war. During the summer of 1941 and into 1942, Fighter Command sweeps was stepped up to help the Russians. Again, they proved expensive, especially in the air battles accompanying the disastrous Dieppe raid in August 1942, the attempt by largely Canadian forces to land at this French Channel port. The RAF hoped to inflict a significant defeat on the Luftwaffe, but the Germans shot down twice as many Allied planes as they lost themselves. Some pilots were rescued by the ships involved in the raid. During the spring of 1943, planning for the cross-channel invasion of France got underway. Fighter Command, which had already had a number of squadrons drawn off for posting abroad, faced a fundamental reorganization. More of its squadrons were handed over to 2nd Tactical Air Force, which had been set up to provide direct support for the Allied invasion forces. And the remainder of Fighter Command was renamed Air Defence of Great Britain. Both forces were placed under Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory. The Tactical Air Force's role was strictly offensive, and it took over Fighter Command's operations over northern France, while ADGB remained purely defensive. One of its tasks was to counter German reconnaissance aircraft, trying to monitor the invasion preparations. Another was to intercept bombers mounting lightning raids. The ADGB's roles appeared unglamorous compared to those that Fighter Command had enjoyed, but its men were soon to be put to the test in what became in effect another Battle of Britain. for the Germans were about to launch another blitz. By the early summer of 1944, what Hitler called his miracle weapons, which he was certain could tip the balance of war back in Germany's favor, were finally ready for action. One of these was the V-1 flying bomb, which carried an 1,800-pound warhead and flew at over 400 miles per hour. The Allies had become aware of the V-1 over a year earlier, and in August 1943 had launched a bombing raid against the development center at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, which set back the program by several months. They also identified and attacked the V-1 launch sites, which the Germans were building in northern France. However, it was not enough. On the 13th of June 1944, a week after the Allied landings in Normandy, the first V-1s were launched against England. Faced with this new threat, the air defense of Great Britain had swiftly to develop tactics for countering the V-1s. Fighters would be scrambled as soon as the flying bombs were spotted approaching the coast, and their pilots soon became adept at shooting them down. But as Roland Beaumont describes, this was not the only way of bringing down a V-1.
Another method, which was come across by accident, was tipping the V-1 over by the wingtip of the fighter. And this happened in my own case when I'd used up my ammunition on one V-1, saw another one, and decided to try and do something about it. And the method was to get your wingtip close underneath the wingtip of the V-1, but not touching it, and then gradually raise your own wing to raise the airflow over it to affect the gyro stabilization of the V-1.
A significant addition to the defenses against the V-1 was the first jet to enter RAF service, the Gloucester Meteor, which made its operational debut on the 12th of July. Although the first Meteors only flew at an equivalent speed to the V-1, their rapid rate of climb made it easy to intercept the flying bombs. Another measure taken was to deploy anti-aircraft guns to the English south coast to engage the V-1s before they got inland. Although V-1 attacks against southern England would continue until the end of March 1945, the back of the offensive had been largely broken by September 1944. But Hitler had another miracle weapon, the V-2 rocket, which had a 1-ton warhead and could reach speeds of 3,500 miles per hour. The first of these struck England on the 9th of September 1944. There was little that ADGB could do, since this first ever ballistic missile flew too high and too fast to be intercepted. The Allied ground advance through France took care of the V-1 fixed launches, but the V-2s remained a threat, since they used mobile launchers. It was only the Allied air offensive against German oil and communications that finally brought the V-2 attacks to a halt. On the 15th of September 1945, on the 5th anniversary of RAF Fighter Command's epic battle, which finally dashed Hitler's dream of invading Britain, a group of veteran fighter pilots gathered at RAF North Weald. Among them was Douglas Bader. Hugh Dowding, who had led the command during those critical days when the fate of Britain hung in the balance, was also there to see his chicks. The pilots then climbed into their planes and took off to fly over war-torn central London at the head of an armada of 300 RAF aircraft. It was a fitting commemoration, both of the end of the war and to the few, the young pilots who had played the lead role in what Churchill had called Britain's finest hour. Many years later, Douglas Bader summed up the spirit of fighter command.
Well, the tremendous comradeship. They're gay. I mean, look at them, they're all old and round the bend now, but you know, they were young and gay and cheerful, you know, in the old days.
Although fighter command itself no longer exists in the Royal Air Force, today's fast jet pilots continue to strive to live up to the courage and dash displayed by their forebears. The Gladiators, in their Hurricanes and Spitfires, who ensured that Britain would fight on against Nazi tyranny.